The phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m., and Maya stared at the name on the screen. Dad, a contact that hadn't appeared in her notifications for 3 years. Not since the morning of her college graduation, when he'd sent a 2-word message. Congratulations, kiddo. Now, there it was again, glowing in the dim light of her minimalist apartment. And her chest tightened, because she knew exactly why he was reaching out. She'd seen it herself just hours earlier, when her assistant had called at midnight. Breathless and crying with joy, Forbes had published their annual 30 under 30 list. And Maya's face was on the cover, her name in bold letters beneath the headline, "The Quiet Revolutionary. How One Woman Built a Mental Health Empire That's Changing Lives." But as she sat on the edge of her bed, barefoot on cold hardwood floors, she didn't feel triumphant or validated. She felt hollow, because the people who should have celebrated every small step of her journey had been silent through it all. And now, when the world was watching, suddenly they wanted in. Maya Chen had always been the invisible daughter, the middle child sandwiched between her older brother David, the surgeon who made their parents beam with pride at every dinner party, and her younger sister Sophie, the concert pianist who'd performed at Carnegie Hall at 16. And Maya, well, Maya had been the quiet one, the one who asked too many questions, who cried too easily, who chose psychology over law school, and disappointed her father so deeply, he'd actually turned away from her at the dinner table when she'd announced her decision, her mother's hand reaching across to touch his arm as if Maya had declared something shameful. She remembered that night with painful clarity. She'd been 21, home for winter break, and she'd practiced her speech for weeks. How she wanted to help people heal from trauma. How she'd volunteered at a crisis helpline and realized this was her calling. But her father, a corporate attorney who measured success in billable hours and corner offices, had simply said, "That's not a career, Maya, that's a hobby." And her mother, ever the peacemaker, had suggested maybe she could do therapy on the side while building something more substantial. And her siblings had said nothing, David checking his phone for hospital updates, Sophie picking at her food, and Maya had felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller, until she wondered if she'd disappear entirely. But she hadn't disappeared. She'd left, moved across the country to Portland with 2 suitcases and a determination that felt both empowering and terrifying. And she'd worked 3 jobs while getting her master's degree, waiting tables at night, tutoring on weekends, doing data entry in the early mornings, sleeping for hours if she was lucky, living on rice and vegetables from the discount bin. And when she'd finally opened her first tiny office, a converted storage room above a bookstore that smelled like old paper and coffee, she'd called her mother to share the news, and her mother had said, "That's nice, honey. But David just got invited to speak at a medical conference in Switzerland." And Maya had held the phone away from her ear, staring at it like it was a foreign object, before whispering, "That's great, Mom," and hanging up feeling like her heart was being pressed in a vice. The years that followed were a blur of 16-hour days, of saying no to dates and friendships, and any semblance of a normal life in her 20s, pouring everything into building something that mattered, and slowly, so slowly, she almost didn't notice at first. It started working. Her practice grew, from 1 client to 5, then 20, then 50, and she hired her first associate, then a second, then a third, and she developed a therapeutic approach that combined traditional therapy with digital tools, creating an app that allowed people in crisis to access immediate support, to connect with counselors trained in trauma, to find community when they felt most alone. And the app went viral after a college student posted about how it had saved her life. During a breakdown at 2 a.m., when she'd had nowhere to turn, and suddenly Maya had 1,000 users, then 10,000, then 100,000, and investors started calling, wanting to fund expansion, and she'd built something beautiful and real and necessary, a company that now employed 200 people and had helped over 3 million individuals find mental health support. But through it all, through every milestone and achievement, her family had remained distant, polite but disengaged. asking surface-level questions during obligatory holiday phone calls. Her father always finding a reason to cut conversations short. Her mother sending brief emails with updates about David's latest surgery innovation or Sophie's upcoming performances in Vienna and Tokyo. And Maya would read these emails sitting in her corner office, overlooking the city. This space she'd built from nothing, and she'd feel like that invisible girl at the dinner table all over again. She'd stopped telling them about her successes after a while when the app hit 1 million users, when she was invited to speak at a mental health summit in front of 4,000 professionals, when venture capitalists valued her company at $50 million, when she opened offices in 12 cities. She kept it to herself because sharing felt like handing her heart to people who'd already shown they didn't know how to hold it. And her therapist, Dr. Reeves, a kind woman in her 60s who'd become both mentor and mother figure, would gently push her to examine why she still craved their approval, why she measured her worth by their attention, and Maya would cry in those sessions, ugly tears that came from a deep well of grief, mourning not the family she had, but the family she'd needed. The parents who would have asked about her work, not because Forbes validated it, but because she loved it. The siblings who would have been curious about her life. Who would have shown up? The Forbes feature had come as a surprise. A journalist had been following her work for months, interviewing clients whose lives had changed, employees who spoke about her leadership with genuine affection, industry experts who called her approach revolutionary. And when the writer had asked Maya about her inspiration, she'd been honest in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. Talking about feeling lost and unseen as a young person, about wanting to create spaces where people's pain was acknowledged and treated with dignity, where no one would feel as invisible as she once had. And maybe she'd said too much, because when she'd finished, the journalist had tears in her eyes and had reached across the table to squeeze Maya's hand, saying this is going to resonate with so many people. The article had published at midnight, and Maya had read it alone in her apartment. This beautiful space she'd decorated with plants and soft lighting and art from local artists. And she'd seen her own story reflected back to her, the struggle, the loneliness, the determination, the impact, and for the first time in years, she'd felt truly seen. Not by her family, but by strangers who understood what it meant to build yourself from broken pieces, and she'd cried then too. But these were different tears, tears of recognition and release. And when her assistant called minutes later, screaming about the social media response, the thousands of shares, the messages flooding in from people saying this is my story too, Maya had felt something shift inside her, a quiet, settling, a sense that maybe she'd been looking for validation in the wrong places all along. And then, 6 hours later, her phone had buzzed with her father's text, and now she sat staring at it, her thumb hovering over the screen, reading the message. Maya saw the Forbes article. Very impressive. We should talk. I'd love to hear about your business. Maybe we could have dinner next week when I'm in Portland for a conference. Proud of you, Dad. And she read it 3 times. 4 times, analyzing every word. The casual tone, the very impressive, as if he were commenting on a nice weather report. The fact that he'd be in Portland anyway for something else, so seeing her wouldn't be out of his way. The proud of you tucked at the end like an afterthought, and something inside her cracked, not with joy but with a deep, aching anger she'd suppressed for years. Because where had this pride been when she'd been drowning in student debt, when she'd worked herself to exhaustion, when she'd called home, crying after a client's suicide and needed someone to tell her she was doing enough, that she couldn't save everyone. She'd signed the lease on her first real office, and had champagne alone, because she had no one to celebrate with. Where had he been then? She set the phone down and walked to her window, looking out at the city waking up, the sun casting golden light across buildings, people starting their days with coffee and routines and the beautiful ordinariness of life. And she thought about all the versions of herself she'd been, the little girl who'd brought home straight A's and watched her parents glance at the report card before returning to discussions about David's science fair project. The teenager who'd won a writing competition and had the ceremony on the same night as Sophie's recital, so no one had come. The young woman who'd tried so hard to be worth noticing that she'd almost lost herself, and the woman she was now, standing in an apartment she owned, leading a company that mattered, surrounded by a chosen family of friends and colleagues who actually showed up, and she realized with startling clarity that she had a choice here. She could respond with the eager to please compliance she'd defaulted to her whole life. Saying yes to dinner, accepting these crumbs of attention, pretending that his sudden interest didn't hurt. Or she could be honest, really honest, for the first time in her relationship with her father, and the thought terrified her but also felt necessary, like something she'd been walking toward her entire life without knowing it. She picked up her phone and started typing, deleting, typing again, her hands shaking slightly, and finally she wrote, "Dad, thank you for reaching out. I've been building this company for 8 years, through every challenge and milestone, and I reached out to share those moments with you many times. I needed you to be interested in my life before the world told you it was valuable. I needed you at the beginning, not the victory lap. I don't want a dinner meeting where you ask about my business metrics. I wanted a father who asked how I was doing on a random Tuesday, who cared about my work because I cared about it, not because Forbes did. I've spent my whole life trying to be worth your attention, and I've realized that your inability to see me has never been about my worth. It's been about what you value and prioritize, and I'm finally okay with that. I don't need your pride now. I needed your presence then, and I'm not angry. I'm just done trying to earn something that should have been freely given. I hope you're well, and I mean that genuinely. But I'm not available for dinner. I'm busy building a life with people who've been here all along." She read it over, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it, and before she could second-guess herself, she hit send, and immediately felt like she might throw up, but also like she could breathe fully for the first time in years. And she waited, staring at the screen, watching the delivered status, then read. And for 10 minutes, nothing happened. And she imagined her father's reaction, the shock, maybe anger, maybe dismissal. And then 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again, and finally a message came through. "You're right, and I'm sorry. I should have said that first. I'm sorry. Maya, I've been a terrible father to you. I see that now, reading about your work, about why you do it, about feeling unseen. That was about me, wasn't it? About how I made you feel, and I don't have an excuse. I was so caught up in what I thought success looked like that I couldn't see the incredible person you were becoming. I called your mother after reading the article, really talked to her for the first time in a while, and she reminded me of all the times you'd called with good news and I'd been too busy, or distracted, or dismissive. And she cried. Maya said she'd failed you too by not standing up for you, by always redirecting conversations to your siblings, and we both sat with that for a long time last night, the weight of what we'd done, or hadn't done. And I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve the chance to explain. But if you'd ever be willing, not for dinner, not for a meeting, but just to talk, as a father and daughter, not about business or achievements, but about life, about you, I would be grateful. But I understand if you're not. I understand if I've broken this beyond repair. And regardless, I want you to know that I see you now. I see the work you've done. Not just the company, but the work of becoming who you are, despite having parents who didn't support that journey. And I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. Maya read her father's message through blurred vision, tears streaming down her face. And she felt the armor she'd built around her heart starting to crack. Not breaking entirely, but allowing some light in, and she realized that this moment, this painful, honest exchange, was worth more than 1,000 proud declarations at dinner parties, because this was real. This was her father actually seeing the impact of his absence and sitting with it instead of deflecting. And while it didn't erase the years of hurt, it was something. It was a beginning, and maybe that was enough for now. Maybe healing didn't require a perfect resolution, but rather an honest acknowledgement of harm and a genuine willingness to do better. And she thought about all the clients she'd worked with, all the conversations about family wounds and the choice between resentment and release. And she'd always said that forgiveness wasn't about excusing behavior, but about freeing yourself from the weight of carrying anger. And here she was, facing that exact choice, and it wasn't easy, or clean, or cinematic, but it was real. She wrote back, "Thank you for that. For the honesty. It means more than you might realize. I'm not ready for a big reconciliation, and I don't know what our relationship looks like going forward, but I'm willing to try small steps. Maybe we could start with a phone call, just to talk. No agenda, and see where that goes. I've built a good life, Dad, surrounded by people who love me, and I don't need you to complete that. But I have space for you to be part of it, if you're willing to actually be present, not the version of present, where you're distracted or comparing me to David and Sophie, but actually here, actually interested. Can you do that?" And his response came quickly. "Yes, I can try. I want to try. When can I call?" And she smiled through her tears, a complicated smile that held grief and hope in equal measure. And she said, "Sunday afternoon, 3 p.m., and he replied, "I'll be there. Thank you, Maya, for giving me a chance I don't deserve." And she set the phone down and sat in the quiet of her apartment, feeling exhausted and raw and strangely peaceful, because she'd spoken her truth without cruelty. She'd set boundaries without burning bridges. She'd honored both her pain and her capacity for grace. And that felt like its own kind of success, one that would never make a Forbes list but mattered infinitely more. Sunday came, and at exactly 3 p.m. her phone rang, and she answered, and her father's voice came through, nervous and uncertain in a way she'd never heard before, saying, "Hi, Maya," and she said, "Hi, Dad." And there was a pause, awkward and fragile, before he said, "I don't really know where to start." And she said, "Maybe you could ask me about my week, just the normal stuff, not the business headlines." And she heard him take a breath and say, "Okay, yes. How was your week? What did you do? How are you?" And it was such a simple question, the kind parents ask children every day, but coming from him, it felt monumental. And she told him about the new cafe she'd tried, about the book she was reading, about her friend's birthday party, about the small, ordinary, beautiful details of her life. And he listened, really listened, asking follow-up questions, laughing at a funny story about her neighbor's overly friendly cat. And for 45 minutes, they talked like they never had before. And when the call ended, Maya sat holding her phone to her chest, and she thought about the Forbes article, about how the world now knew her name and her work. But this quiet conversation with her father, where she was seen not as a success story, but as a person, this was the validation that actually touched the wounded places inside her. And she realized that sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not on magazine covers, but in the small, brave moments, when people choose honesty over comfort, when they acknowledge harm and take genuine steps toward repair. And while she didn't know if her relationship with her father would ever be fully healed, she knew she'd honored herself in the process. She'd refused to abandon her own worth while still leaving room for grace. And that balance, that difficult, necessary balance, was perhaps the most important thing she'd ever built, not a company or an app or a mental health empire, but a sense of self that didn't require external validation to know its value. A foundation strong enough to weather both neglect and sudden attention without losing its center. And as the sun set over Portland, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Maya stood at her window and felt genuinely, completely proud of herself, not for the Forbes cover or the millions of users or the business metrics, but for the journey of becoming someone who could be both strong enough to speak truth and soft enough to allow for reconciliation. Someone who'd transformed her pain into purpose and her invisibility into a mission to ensure others felt seen. And she understood now that her family's inability to recognize her worth had never diminished it. Their validation, or lack thereof, had never been the measure of her value. She'd always been enough, even when she was invisible at the dinner table, even when her calls went unreturned, even when her achievements were met with indifference. She had always been enough, and that truth, finally internalized not just intellectually, but in the deepest parts of her being, was the real revolution, the quiet transformation that no headline could capture, but that changed everything nonetheless.